Imagine for a moment that the statues lining the grand boulevards of 19th century European capitals were not merely decorative monuments to the past, but something far more dangerous. That civic authorities, acting on knowledge whispered down through generations, ordered these stone and bronze figures draped in heavy cloth each evening, not to protect them from weather or vandals, but to shield the populace from what might emerge when darkness fell. That across dozens of cities, from Vienna to Paris, from Moscow to Rome, a peculiar ritual unfolded nightly, a ritual whose true purpose has been deliberately obscured, reduced to footnotes about preservation practices in dusty municipal archives. What were they really afraid of, and why did this practice cease so abruptly in the early 20th century, coinciding with events that rewrote not just maps, but collective memory itself? To understand this enigma, we must first reconstruct the world as it existed in the latter half of the 1800s, a world that presents us with bewildering contradictions at every turn. Picture yourself standing on a cobblestone avenue in Vienna during the 1870s. Around you rise buildings of such staggering architectural ambition that modern engineers openly admit they cannot fully explain their construction methods. These aren't simple structures, they're Baroque palaces spanning entire city blocks, adorned with hundreds of individually carved stone figures, each one unique, each one requiring thousands of hours of skilled labor. The facades display geometric precision that would challenge contemporary laser-cut techniques, yet we're told they were accomplished with hand tools and wooden scaffolding. The sheer scale defies the official narrative of available workforce and time frame. How does a civilization that supposedly lacked powered machinery, that relied on horse-drawn carts and manual hoists, create urban landscapes that dwarf modern construction in both scope and ornamental complexity? How do they quarry, transport, carve and install millions upon millions of tons of granite and marble across dozens of cities simultaneously, all while fighting continental wars and dealing with repeated cholera epidemics that allegedly decimated their populations? The mathematics simply don't reconcile. Yet there they stand, these impossible monuments to a building capacity we cannot replicate today, at least not without admitting that the available population, technology, and timeline recorded in official histories are fundamentally incorrect. The streets of these cities tell their own troubling story. Beneath the cobblestones and later asphalt, beneath the gas lines and water mains installed in the 1800s, excavations consistently reveal older streets, deeper foundations, underground chambers, and tunnel networks that stretch for miles. These aren't medieval structures. The masonry techniques, the scale, the engineering sophistication all point to something earlier and far more advanced. In city after city, the ground floor of historic buildings sits 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet below the current street level. Entire neighborhoods appear to have been buried, then rebuilt on top of themselves. Official explanations cite gradual accumulation or raising of street levels, but these explanations crumble under scrutiny. Gradual accumulation doesn't create uniform burial depths across vast areas. Gradual accumulation doesn't fill basement windows with compressed earth overnight. Something catastrophic happened, something that deposited massive quantities of material across continental expanses, something that buried the previous civilization layer under meters of mud and debris. And when this event occurred, whenever that truly was, it wasn't gradual. It was sudden, violent, and global in scope. The survivors who emerged from whatever catastrophe reshaped the world found themselves living atop the ruins, salvaging what they could, repurposing structures they could no longer fully replicate, inheriting a built environment they no longer completely understood. This is why restoration projects in the 1800s so often look suspiciously like new construction, because they were. A post-catastrophe civilization was reverse engineering the architecture of its predecessors, copying forms without grasping the underlying principles. Now focus your attention on the statues themselves, these stone and bronze figures that dominate every significant public space, that crown every building, that line every major thoroughfare. Official history presents them as products of the 19th century's statue mania, a commemorative impulse to honor national heroes and allegorical virtues. But examine them more carefully. Their scale is wrong, consistently wrong. These aren't life-sized figures. They're representations of beings 8, 10, 12 feet tall, anatomically perfect but proportionally gigantic, Every major city possesses hundreds or thousands of these oversized figures, all apparently carved within a few decades by armies of sculptors whose individual work would require multiple lifetimes to complete. The official timeline doesn't accommodate the labor involved, even allowing for multiple workshops, multiple artisans, and continuous production. The sheer volume of individual sculptural work supposedly accomplished between 1830 and 1890 requires a workforce and organizational capacity that the recorded population cannot support, unless, of course, these statues weren't created in the 19th century at all. Unless they're remnants of an earlier period, salvaged from buried structures, re-erected, and given new identities and narratives to fit the post-catastrophe civilization's mythology. Look at their faces, weathering patterns inconsistent with claimed ages, repair work evident in foundation pedestals, but not in the figures themselves, stylistic incongruities between statue and pedestal, suggesting they weren't originally paired. These aren't monuments to imagined heroes. They're portraits of actual beings from the predecessor civilization, recontextualized by survivors who no longer fully understood what they represented. The practice of covering these statues at night emerges in municipal records across Europe during the 1860s and 70s, introduced quietly, implemented systematically, and justified with vague references to protection and preservation. In Vienna, the city council minutes from 1872 reference the necessary nightly veiling of public monuments in accordance with traditional wisdom, suggesting this wasn't a new innovation, but a revival of older practices. Similar language appears in Paris, where an 1875 directive orders the customary draping of principal statuary during hours of darkness, as has been maintained since time immemorial in knowledgeable circles. In Rome, the practice seems never to have ceased. Ancient protocols simply continued into the modern era, absorbed into municipal maintenance routines without anyone questioning their origin or purpose. What traditional wisdom were they following? What knowledge had been maintained by these knowledgeable circles? The official explanations: protection from weather, prevention of vandalism, preservation of surface patinas, collapse under the slightest examination. Weather doesn't pause at sunset. Vandals don't exclusively operate during daylight, and if patina preservation were the goal, why not permanent coverings? Why the elaborate ritual of nightly draping and morning removal, requiring dedicated crews, specialized equipment, and significant municipal expense? What were they really protecting the public from encountering after dark? If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. The clues lie scattered through peripheral documentation, police reports, asylum records, newspaper items that somehow escaped editorial censorship before publication practices became more controlled in the 1880s. From Munich in 1874 comes a constable's incident report describing a disturbance near the Feldherrnhalle monument at 3 o'clock in the morning. Several witnesses reported seeing the statue figures moving, turning their heads, gesturing to one another. The constable attributes this to mass delusion, possibly induced by gaslight reflections and fog, but notably he also records that the statues had somehow been left uncovered that evening due to an oversight by the maintenance crew. The same crew was permanently dismissed the following week, not for negligence, but under a vague administrative reorganization that removed them from municipal employment entirely. From Paris in 1877 comes a more disturbing account, published briefly in a minor daily newspaper before being retracted in subsequent editions as printer's error. A night watchman at the Luxembourg Gardens claimed to have witnessed the bronze figures in the Medici fountain emerge from their poses and move about the garden, conversing in an unknown language. He fled, returned with 2 colleagues, and found everything as it should be, except that the bronze statues' positions had subtly changed. Their arms, previously at their sides, now extended slightly forward. Their faces, previously in profile, now faced directly outward. The newspaper printed a retraction stating the watchman had been drinking, but the watchman himself disappeared from employment records entirely, and the fountain statues were fully covered for the next 6 months during a supposed restoration that left no visible changes to the structures themselves. The asylum records prove even more illuminating and more carefully suppressed. Across multiple institutions in Vienna, Berlin, and Prague during the 1870s and 80s, a peculiar category of patient admission emerges. individuals admitted for monument-related disturbances of reason. These aren't isolated cases, they number in the dozens across just the facilities whose records have survived. The patients share remarkably consistent symptoms and stories. They report encountering statues that moved, that watched them, that communicated through gesture or direct mental impression. They describe being followed by stone and bronze figures during late-night passages through public squares. They claim the statues know things, hidden things about the past, about events that supposedly never occurred, about a world that existed before the catastrophe. And most disturbingly, they report that the statues are waiting for something or someone to return. The medical notes are dismissive, attributing these accounts to various forms of hysteria and delusion, but read between the lines and a different picture emerges. These patients aren't raving, they're consistently articulate, their accounts detailed and coherent. They don't exhibit typical symptoms of psychosis or substance-induced hallucination. What they exhibit is terror, profound existential terror of something they witnessed that shouldn't exist according to the accepted framework of reality. And the treatment they receive isn't standard psychiatric care of the era, it's isolation, sedation, and in several cases, documented use of experimental procedures designed to correct aberrant memory formation. They weren't being treated for madness, they were being silenced. Their memories weren't being healed, they were being erased. Parallel to these individual incidents runs a broader pattern, visible only when examining multiple cities across multiple decades, a pattern of accidents, incidents, and unexplained phenomena clustering around specific types of monuments. Statues depicting certain figures, warriors, kings, ancient gods, mythological beings, seem to attract disproportionate numbers of unusual occurrences. People falling near them under mysterious circumstances, sudden illnesses affecting those who spend extended time in their vicinity, reports of electromagnetic disturbances and compass malfunctions in their immediate areas, photographs from the period showing strange luminous anomalies around particular figures. In St. Petersburg, an equestrian statue erected in 1882 became the center of such persistent reports of nighttime disturbances that authorities eventually relocated it to a less prominent position, officially due to aesthetic reconsideration, but accompanied by municipal records noting persistent public unease and escalating incident reports. The statue depicted Peter the Great, or rather it depicted a figure officially identified as Peter the Great, though contemporary accounts note that the face bore little resemblance to established portraits, and the proportions suggested someone substantially larger than the recorded 6 feet 8 inches of the historical Peter. Was this truly a monument to the Russian emperor, or was it something else, something salvaged from deeper, older strata and assigned a convenient identity? And what about this figure specifically triggered such consistent disturbances that authorities had to physically remove it from public interaction? The practice of nightly covering extends beyond statues to include certain architectural elements, gargoyles, relief sculptures, carved figures adorning building facades. In Gothic cathedrals across Europe, protocols existed for veiling specific grotesques and chimeras during particular dates, not just nightly, but seasonally, aligned with old calendar systems that don't match modern reckonings. These aren't Christian practices, they're older, absorbed into church maintenance routines, and given thin religious justifications that don't withstand theological scrutiny. The Vatican archives contain extensive documentation about these protocols, though access remains severely restricted. What has leaked suggests that church authorities maintain detailed knowledge about which figures required covering, when, and under what circumstances, knowledge they categorized as protective wisdom necessary for prevention of recurring manifestations. Recurring manifestations of what? The documents don't specify, or the specifications have been redacted from accessible copies, but they reference events of prior centuries and precedents from the period before the Great Forgetting. That phrase, the Great Forgetting, appears repeatedly in church documents from the 18th and 19th centuries. Not the Dark Ages, not the medieval period, but the Great Forgetting, as though there was a specific event, a demarcation point when collective memory fractured and knowledge was deliberately obscured. When was this? What happened? And what role did covered statuary play in either the event itself or the suppression of memory about it? By the 1890s, the practice of covering statues begins to decline precipitously across Europe, not because the underlying concerns disappeared, but because a new approach emerges. Electric street lighting arrives, illuminating public spaces throughout the night, and suddenly the elaborate ritual of draping and unveiling becomes unnecessary, according to municipal authorities. The official explanation centers on visibility. Constant light eliminates shadows, reduces opportunities for vandalism, makes spaces safer. But notice what else electric lighting accomplishes. It creates constant observation, uninterrupted surveillance of the monuments themselves. If the concern was what might happen to or around these statues under cover of darkness, perpetual illumination solves that problem more efficiently than nightly draping. The statues remain visible, watched, contained within human awareness at all times. There's no period of unobserved darkness during which they might animate, communicate, resume whatever function they originally served. The shift from covering to illumination represents not abandonment of the underlying concern, but evolution of containment strategy, from physical barrier to perpetual observation. And this transition coincides suspiciously with another development, the systematic photographing and cataloging of all major public monuments across European capitals, creating permanent records of their exact positions, poses, and features. As though authorities needed baseline documentation against which to measure any subtle changes that might occur despite the new illumination regime. What were they expecting to change? What had changed before, during those unrecorded centuries before the catastrophe, before the Great Forgetting, when these figures perhaps served purposes their inheritors could no longer fully comprehend? The 20th century brings the final phase of this evolution, not covering or illuminating, but removing. World War I provides convenient justification. Monuments must be protected from bombardment. Metal must be collected for war production. Thousands upon thousands of statues across Europe are dismantled, ostensibly for protection or recycling. But examine the pattern of what gets removed versus what remains. The largest figures, the oldest seeming pieces, the monuments with the most persistent associated folklore, these vanish first and most completely. Many never return to their original positions. Municipal records cite war damage or irreparable deterioration or simple administrative decisions, but the actual fate of these pieces becomes extraordinarily difficult to trace. They enter warehouses and never emerge. They're supposedly melted down, yet metal collection records don't account for appropriate tonnages. They're documented as destroyed, yet occasional references surface decades later suggesting they were relocated to secure facilities, studied, analyzed by specialists whose expertise isn't architectural but something else entirely, something related to material science, electromagnetic properties, information encoding in crystalline structures. The war provides perfect cover for a systematic removal operation targeting specific artifacts, specific remnants of the predecessor civilization that posed persistent problems for the inheritor population. Problems that covering addressed temporarily, that illumination mitigated partially, but that ultimately required physical sequestration to fully contain. World War II intensifies this pattern exponentially. Bombing flattens entire city centers, and in the reconstruction that follows, the pre-war statue populations never fully return. New monuments replace old ones, smaller, more modern in style, explicitly commemorating 20th century events and figures. The architectural language changes fundamentally, where 19th century public sculpture emphasized giants, gods, mythological beings. Post-war monuments focus on ordinary humans at ordinary scale, soldiers and workers and abstract forms. It's as though a conscious decision was made to eliminate the visual reminder of those oversized predecessor beings, to normalize human scale, to erase the persistent suggestion that humanity once existed in different forms or alongside different forms. And in cities where old monuments do return, they return altered, reproduced in lighter materials, reduced in scale, simplified in detail. The originals disappear into protective storage that proves permanent. Berlin provides a perfect case study, hundreds of statues removed for protection during the war years, dozens supposedly destroyed in bombardment, yet post-war inventory reveals warehouses full of intact figures that nonetheless never return to public display. They remain classified under various bureaucratic categories, damaged beyond restoration, culturally problematic, awaiting conservation resources that somehow never materialize. Or they're simply erased from inventory records entirely, existing in neither public spaces nor official storage, vanished as thoroughly as if they never existed, despite photographic evidence of their original presence. Consider the implications of what we're observing here, a multi-century progression from ritualized covering to illumination to systematic removal, targeting specific artifacts from a predecessor civilization whose very existence official histories deny or minimize. If these were simply decorative monuments created in the 19th century as commemoration exercises, none of this protocol makes sense. Decorative objects don't require nightly veiling according to traditional wisdom. Decorative objects don't trigger consistent reports of anomalous behavior. Decorative objects don't warrant permanent sequestration under classifications suggesting they pose ongoing risks. The pattern only makes sense if these weren't decorative at all, if they served functions in the predecessor civilization that their inheritors discovered, accidentally or through preserved knowledge, could sometimes resume under specific conditions. What functions? The scattered clues suggest information storage, communication across distances, perhaps even consciousness transfer or projection. Advanced civilizations don't limit their information storage to fragile paper and ink. They encode it in durable materials, in crystalline matrices, in molecular structures that can persist for millennia. Stone and bronze fit these requirements perfectly. If you wanted to preserve knowledge across a civilization-ending catastrophe, you wouldn't trust it to libraries that can burn. You'd encode it in monuments, in structures too massive and numerous to fully destroy, distributed across continents so that surviving populations would inevitably encounter them. But if you wanted to suppress that knowledge after the catastrophe, if you wanted inheritor populations to remain ignorant of what came before, you'd need to neutralize these monuments without destroying them entirely, cover them, illuminate them, eventually remove them from public interaction while maintaining enough examples to avoid provoking questions about complete elimination. This brings us to the most disturbing hypothesis, the one that unifies all these patterns into coherent framework. What if the catastrophe that buried the predecessor civilization wasn't natural? What if it was deliberately induced, a controlled demolition of advanced civilization by forces that benefited from resetting human development to pre-technological baseline? And what if the statues, the monuments, the architectural giants represent not just information storage from that lost world but actual beings, preserved somehow in stone and bronze, dormant but not dead, waiting for conditions that would allow reactivation? This would explain the terror in asylum records, the desperate covering protocols, the eventual systematic removal. The inheritor civilization wasn't just suppressing knowledge, it was preventing resurrection. The Great Forgetting wasn't accidental amnesia following trauma, it was engineered amnesia, deliberately induced and maintained across generations through control of information, alteration of records, and elimination of physical evidence that might trigger recovered memory. The covered statues represent the most dangerous category of evidence because they're both information storage and potential actors. They can tell the truth about what happened and potentially act upon that truth if somehow reactivated. Every city in Europe, every major population center, inherited hundreds or thousands of these dormant time capsules / sleeping giants from the destroyed civilization. Local authorities, working from fragmentary knowledge passed down through limited channels, understood enough to know they needed containment, but not enough to know full truth of what they were containing. The protocols evolved pragmatically, from trial and error, from observed effects and whispered warnings. Cover them at night when ambient energies shift and strange things happen. Illuminate them constantly when technology permits uninterrupted observation. Remove them entirely when social upheaval provides justifying circumstances for massive artifact displacement. The implications extend beyond Europe, beyond statuary specifically, to the entire built environment of the 19th century that we've been systematically trained not to question. Those impossible cities, with their millions of tons of carved stone, their miles of underground infrastructure, their architectural ambitions that dwarf modern capabilities, they weren't built by the populations and technologies officially credited. They're inherited ruins, salvaged and repurposed by a post-catastrophe civilization that lost the capacity to create such works, but retained enough functionality to occupy and modify them. The demographic numbers don't work otherwise. The timeline doesn't work. The technology doesn't work. Official history requires us to believe that civilization capable of building scattered medieval castles and modest Renaissance palaces suddenly, within single generation, developed capacity to construct monuments and infrastructure that modern society with all its machinery and vast population struggles to replicate. This doesn't represent technological advancement. It represents inheritance and imitation. The successors found a world in ruins, buried under meters of catastrophe-deposited material, and excavated what they could use. They cleared the buried first floors and made them basements. They claimed the statues and assigned new identities to match invented histories. They reverse-engineered architectural techniques they didn't fully grasp, producing the eclectic mixing of styles characteristic of 19th century construction, because they weren't developing coherent architectural vision, but copying whatever examples they unearthed, combining elements from multiple predecessor periods without understanding original contexts. The result is that distinctive visual chaos of European capitals, Baroque facades on Gothic foundations, Renaissance ornamentation on structures that use Roman engineering, classical proportions executed with mysterious masonry techniques that don't match any historical period because they predate official historical chronology entirely, and the catastrophe itself, the event that ended the predecessor civilization and necessitated this inheritance situation, we can reconstruct its characteristics from environmental evidence despite systematic attempts to obscure it. Global in scope, sudden in onset, involving massive displacement of material that buried cities, disrupted infrastructure, and deposited uniform layers of sediment across continental areas. Accompanied by fires on civilizational scale, explaining the persistent burnt layers found beneath so many cities, the carbon-rich deposits, the evidence of temperatures inconsistent with accidental fires or even warfare-related burning. The chronology is deliberately confused, stretched backward in official histories to make gradual what was actually instantaneous, distributed across centuries what happened in days or weeks. The mud flood, the global conflagration, the demographic collapse, these weren't separate events scattered across decades. They were phases of single catastrophic sequence. First came fire, whether from cosmic impact, solar micronova, or deliberately deployed advanced weapons. This explains the global burnt layer, the vitrified structures, the temperatures that melted stone. Then came water, whether from displaced oceans, atmospheric collapse, or liquefied ground material. This explains the uniform mud deposits, the buried cities, the sedimentary layers containing jumbled artifacts from multiple technological periods mixed together. Then came the demographic collapse, as survivors struggled in devastated landscape without infrastructure, without food production systems, without the technological base that had supported predecessor civilizations' population levels. The survivors who emerged from underground shelters or fortified structures found a world buried and burnt, its population reduced by 90% or more, its knowledge base shattered, its technological continuity broken. What they built afterward, over the next few centuries that official history stretches into millennia, represents desperate salvage operation by inheritors who no longer fully understood what they inherited. The statues, in this context, take on additional significance as deliberate messages from those who saw catastrophe coming and attempted to preserve knowledge through the destruction. Not just artistic monuments, but encoded information matrices, consciousness backups, insurance policies against complete civilizational extinction. The oversized scale might represent not just aesthetic choice, but actual physical dimensions of predecessor beings, giants by our standards, normal by theirs, suggesting genetic divergence between predecessor civilization and inheritor population. This would explain the consistent giant mythology across cultures, the persistent folklore about previous ages of different human types, the archaeological evidence of oversized skeletal remains that mysteriously disappear into institutional collections never to be studied publicly. What if these weren't myths at all? What if the predecessor civilization consisted of different human phenotype, larger and perhaps more technologically advanced, deliberately reduced or replaced by the catastrophe and its aftermath? The statues then become not just information storage but actual representations, portraits of real individuals encoded in stone, perhaps even containing consciousness matrices that might someday be recoverable if technology advanced sufficiently. This is what the covering protocols prevented. Accidental activation, premature contact before inheritor civilization developed capacity to safely interact with predecessor consciousness. The illumination regime continues this containment through different means. Constant observation prevents unsupervised interaction, maintains control over potential activation scenarios, and the eventual removal sequesters the most dangerous examples entirely, placing them under institutional control where investigation can proceed without public awareness or interference. We must confront the possibility that what we call history is actually a constructed narrative created to explain an inherited built environment that doesn't match the capabilities of those who claim to have created it. The 19th century wasn't a period of unprecedented construction boom. It was a period of unprecedented salvage, excavation, and repurposing of predecessor civilizations' remains. The statues weren't carved during this period. They were uncovered, cleaned, and given new contextual frameworks through fabricated biographies and assigned identities. The elaborate covering rituals preserved knowledge that these weren't what official narratives claimed, that they carried risks and properties not fully understood, that interaction required protocols maintained through institutional memory even when underlying reasons became obscured. As electric lighting and then systematic removal provided new containment methods, the covering practice became obsolete, not because the underlying concern vanished, but because more effective control mechanisms emerged. Yet traces remain visible to those willing to look past official explanations and recognize patterns consistent across cities, across decades, across the systematic evolution of increasingly sophisticated containment strategies. The predecessor civilization left messages encoded in stone, left portraits of themselves watching over the inheritors, left consciousness matrices waiting for reactivation. The inheritors, recognizing danger they couldn't fully comprehend, developed pragmatic responses. Cover them, light them, hide them, anything to prevent whatever might happen if these ancient sentinels fully awaken. Today, the few remaining 19th century monuments still in original position stand illuminated, photographed, catalogued, stripped of mystery by constant exposure and surveillance. We are encouraged to see them as merely decorative historical curiosities, artistic achievements of periods we think we understand. But next time you encounter one of these oversized stone or bronze figures in a European capital, look closely. Notice the weathering patterns that don't match claimed ages. Notice the anatomical perfection at impossible scale. Notice how the eyes, despite being carved stone, seem to follow your movement. Notice how the pose, apparently static, might be slightly different from photographs taken decades ago. Notice how your modern cameras occasionally produce inexplicable artifacts, luminous anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, image corruption around specific figures. And ask yourself, what are they really? What did they do before the catastrophe? What might they do again if conditions permit? The covering protocols existed for reasons municipal authorities only partly understood, implementing wisdom preserved from predecessor knowledge systems. Those reasons haven't disappeared, they've simply been addressed through different methods, through illumination and removal rather than veiling. But the underlying reality remains. These aren't decorations, they're dormant technology. They aren't tributes to imagined heroes, they're portraits of actual predecessor beings. They aren't products of the 19th century, they're remnants of civilizations that existed before the catastrophe reset human development and necessitated the Great Forgetting. And somewhere in secure facilities we're not permitted to access, authorities who understand far more than they admit continue to study the sequestered examples, attempting to unlock their secrets while preventing public awareness of what those secrets might reveal about our true history, our true origins, and the true nature of the catastrophe that separated inheritors from predecessors. The covered statues were just the visible edge of much deeper mystery, one that authorities across centuries have worked systematically to obscure, contain, and ultimately erase from collective awareness. But the stone remembers, even when humanity forgets. The bronze remembers, even when records lie. And perhaps someday, under conditions we cannot predict or prevent, those ancient sentinels might remember themselves back into full awareness, revealing truths that will shatter every comfortable assumption about who we are, where we came from, and what was lost in the catastrophe we've been taught never to question.